If you're a founder preparing for your first ever phase 2 clinical trial, this video is for you. In this video, we'll cover what phase 2 clinical trials are and how they differ from phase 1, and how to plan budgets and timelines, as well as scaling up with the right sites and partners. We'll also touch a bit on how to set clear endpoints without over-engineering your study, and how to navigate evolving regulatory and investor expectations, as well as a few practical tips on if you're venture-backed or if you're a bootstrapped company running this study. By the end of this video, you should have somewhat of a roadmap to approach a phase 2 clinical trial in a more founder-focused, practical manner. Let's dive in. The main differences between a phase 1 and a phase 2 clinical trial is the scope of what you're looking into. During phase 1 clinical trials, we're all about looking for safety and testing a new drug in a small group of patients, usually about 20 to 100 people, to find a safe dose and observe any side effects. In contrast, phase 2 clinical trials shift focus to whether the drug works in the target population while continuing to monitor for safety. Another difference is phase 1 studies typically use healthy patients, except in certain illnesses like cancer, whereas phase 2 involves patients who actually have the disease or condition. This means everything in phase 2 is more patient centric, and you're now dealing with people who stand to benefit from the treatment and not just healthy subjects. Another third difference is the scale. Oftentimes, phase 1 studies are small and phase 2 studies tend to be larger with up to 50 to a few hundred patients. See, another thing that you can observe for is the goals of what you're trying to study. In phase 1, you define the drug's tolerability, and in phase 2, you're observing for safety signal. Does the drug meaningfully help patients? So now that we know what a phase 2 is, let's talk about some common phase 2 trial designs, because picking the right trial design is very important with ensuring the success of your study. The first and most popular trial design for phase 2 is a randomized control trial. In many cases, randomized control trials with a control group are preferred in phase 2 because they help you get a clear read on efficacy. Randomized RCTs help ensure that any improvement that the patient see is due to the drug and not just due to chance or selection bias. Another phase 2 design is a dose ranging study whereby you seek out to evaluate which is the most optimal dose for the patients that will be taking this drug. Here, instead of carrying over one dose from phase 1, you might test, say, a low, medium, and high dose in parallel. This type of design is becoming increasingly popular with regulators. The idea here is they want you to avoid making the mistake where you take the wrong dose into phase 3. So a dose-ranging phase 2 trial can identify if a lower dose works nearly as well with fewer side effects, or confirm that the high dose is needed. I think I should also spend some time to explain what the difference between a phase 2A and a phase 2B clinical trial are. You may have heard these terms: phase 2A, which is an exploratory dose finding study, versus a phase 2B, which is a confirmatory dose or efficacy study. In practice, many first-time founders roll straight through and just say phase 2, but conceptually, phase 2A is like a pilot efficacy study. It may be smaller, possibly not fully controlled, and aimed at exploring whether the drug has any efficacy signals and at what dosage. But a phase 2B is a more rigorous trial in a larger patient group to confirm the efficacy at the chosen dose range and nail down the protocol for phase 3. Phase 2 clinical trials are also a really good way to nail down adaptive designs. You may want to explore. This is usually the time when you can explore running a clinical trial with multiple arms, which include various doses and a placebo. Now that we've spoken about a few clinical trial designs for phase 2, let's dive into budgeting and timeline planning for phase 2, which is what this video is about. Phase 2 clinical trials are a major step up in cost and complexity compared to phase 1s. And as a founder, you need to plan both budget and the timeline meticulously. They will be larger than phase 1, and because they will be larger than phase 1, and underestimating that can cause big headaches. Let's start with timeline. Typically, these vary but often last several months to about 2 years. This includes the time to enroll all the patients, which could be a few months to over a year, depending on how rare the condition is or on how many sites you have. And then there is the treatment and follow-up periods. So it's best to plan for the higher end when working on your estimates because delays are common. And now let's talk about costs. This is usually a big question from founders. What will a phase 2 trial cost in the US? While that varies wildly, a ballpark range is in the mid to single digit millions, upwards of about $20 million for a single phase 2. But the exact cost will depend on the number of patients, which is a major cost driver, and the complexity of the procedures that will be performed. For example, if you're bringing in 100 patients with simple clinic visits and blood tests, this will cost much less than bringing in 300 patients who have to undergo MRIs and biopsies. To break it down, the cost per patient in each phase 2 may range from $30,000 to about $80,000 per patient, depending on the procedures and the therapeutic area. So when cost planning, don't forget to buffer for contingencies like slow enrollment, protocol amendments, or higher than expected screening failure rates. Another thing that you should budget for is staffing. In a phase 1, you may have operated with a very small team and perhaps one site, but when you go into a phase 2, you would require more hands on deck. So you want to consider key roles that you will need to have on your team, from clinical operations to medical monitoring to data management and biostatistics. You also want to budget for regulatory personnel as well as site and CRO personnel as well. Let's talk about CROs for a minute. If you're working with a CRO, they often have data on things like site performance across different types of trials. So you want to get the CRO to give you that type of information in terms of the sites and the types of patients that these sites have access to. You also want to look into the experience and the infrastructure at each of these sites. Do these sites have experienced research staff, and do they have the facilities to perform all the procedures required in the protocol? For the purpose of this video, we're talking about studies that happen in the US only. So think about geographical distribution. Within the US, different regions offer different types of patients, and within the US, different geographical regions offer different types of patient distributions. CROs can help a lot, but they're also very expensive. So when you're working with a CRO, you need to find a CRO that has experience within your specific therapeutic area and the specific phase that you're working on. If you're developing, say, a neurology drug, a CRO that has experience in CNS trials will know the pitfalls. For example, how to assess cognitive endpoints and how to find neurology investigators. You also want to work with a CRO that is flexible and agile and that can work with you as a small team. A lot of CROs handle clinical trials for very big pharmaceutical and biotech companies, and a lot of times smaller companies cannot really work well with bigger CROs. So make sure you're finding CROs that you think have a good culture that you can work with. You also want to do a lot of references and trust your gut. Talk to other founders who have used CROs and their experiences with using certain types of CROs. Did the CROs meet the timelines? Did they communicate well? Specifically, ask smaller companies like yourself, which may be at the same stage, if they felt like they were a priority. Aside from a CRO, you will also need other types of specialty vendors like a central laboratory, which will be used to run all your standardized lab tests. You may also need other specialties like an imaging lab if your trial requires imaging, or other clinical supply vendors if you need to package and distribute your drugs to sites. You also need to get a vendor to provide you with an electronic data capture system to manage your case report forms. These are often provided via CRO, but not all the time. And you will need additional software like randomization software, as well as a biomarker or specialty assay if your study requires you to have specialized blood tests or genetic tests. Now that we've touched on CROs, let's talk about another big challenge that first-time trial designers have to grapple with, which is picking the right endpoints to optimize for. It is important that you set very clear, meaningful endpoints to avoid the trap of over-engineering your trial. Your trial should have one, maybe two primary endpoints that truly capture the clinical benefit you hope to demonstrate. This could be a clinical outcome like improvement in a symptom score or tumor shrinkage or blood pressure reduction. But you need to choose something that is well justified, accepted, and expected in your field. And to do this, you must avoid over engineering. It's very easy to fall into the trap of adding many just in case endpoints and involve When we've picked our primary endpoint, we can find a few secondary endpoints as well that are well chosen and that can help strengthen your story. Think about what could bolster your case if the primary endpoint shows a hit. It may be things like quality of life improvement or a relevant biomarker that helps explain the mechanism of action. Note that simplicity means accessibility. If you over engineer your clinical trial protocol, this means that your patients will have to have too many visits, which will lead to a lot of patients struggling and dropping out of your study. Before you go into your phase two, you have to define what success is upfront. As a founder, defining what a phase two success looks like in concrete terms is very important before even going into the study. If you can say, for example, we aim to improve this disease by at least 30% versus the placebo at 12 weeks, that is a clear goal. And as you set this goal, you should keep at the back of your mind that every drug in America is paid for by insurance providers. So you want to have those at the back of your mind as you set your goals and your endpoints, because ultimately, these regulators and payers want to know that the drug has a benefit risk profile that warrants a phase three and an eventual approval. Insurers and payers will later care if the outcomes are meaningful and not just a tiny change in the lab value. If your phase two ends up being positive, then you will have to provide a timeline for your phase three. So your investors or your partners may even start pushing you to start thinking about a phase three design while your phase two is ongoing. So showing that you have a vision beyond just the phase two is also a great thing to have. So in order for you to stay ahead of the curve, a few things that you can do is to start engaging with the FDA early and also keep your partners in the loop of how things are progressing. And most importantly, don't cut corners that could undermine your phase two's data quality. It may save a buck for now, but will cost you tens of millions of dollars later if the data credibility is in doubt. Now, a few tips for founders is if you're venture backed or if you're well funded, use your resources wisely but boldly. Having a solid budget means that you can invest in aspects that de-risk the trial. For example, you can afford a few extra sites to ensure enrollment stays on track, or incorporate an interim analysis with an independent committee for safety oversight. These add cost but can protect the program. You can also focus on hiring key talent if you have the funds to build out your internal team with experienced clinical operators and regulatory folks. But don't overspend or go play the trial out of sheer optimism. There is a balance between using funds to ensure quality and over engineering. But if you're bootstrapped or if you're running this trial lean, then you need to know that every dollar counts. But even on a lean budget, don't cut critical corners. You need to prioritize spending on the essentials that ensure that your data will be credible. For example, you might limit the number of sites to save costs, but make sure that the few sites that you're working with are excellent so you still get good enrollment results. You can also look for other alternative funding sources like within the federal government if those are things that you think you can access. And leverage other types of partnerships. You may not have the cash or a global CRO that you're working with, but perhaps you can partner with an academic network or a cooperative group if applicable. You can also work with lower cost CROs and vendors. There are a lot of CROs that are geared towards smaller companies and offer lower rates. And that's because they're able to do clinical trials with leaner staff and may offshore certain parts of running the clinical trial, which can save a lot but still deliver the quality that you need. But overall, if you're running lean, the most important thing that you would have to do is to have a strategic trial design. If you cannot afford a large phase 2B, then maybe you may design a smart phase 2A that gets the most information per patient. You can also be creative with the way that you pay your vendors and your consultants. Certain companies may be open to taking equity in or deferring fees until when you're able to pay them. So good luck on your phase two journey. You've got this. And if you have any questions on how to run a phase two in the US, let me know in the comments.